FDR said, let's look at the first 100 days and see if we're getting through this depression. The measure has mattered. And in 2 national polls, President Trump's approval rating is hitting historic lows. An ABC News Washington Post poll shows 42% of Americans approve of what Trump has done in office. An NBC News Wall Street Journal poll shows 40% approval. Those would be at the lowest levels of any president at the 100-day mark in decades. But that is not the whole story. Let's discuss CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein, Jackie Kucinich, and national security correspondent for the New York Times, David Sanger. Professor Brownstein, nobody loves the numbers like you. What are the headlines? What are the caveats?
Yeah, no, I think these poll results are showing a very consistent and distinctive pattern for Donald Trump, not only in the poll results, but going back through the actual election results last November and even into the primaries. And they tell you the same story one after the other, which is that President Trump has a powerful, even visceral hold on his coalition, which is primarily older, non-urban, religious and blue-collar whites, many of who feel left behind by cultural, demographic, and especially economic change. And those voters are strongly with him. 96% of those voters said they would vote for him again. But that was 46% of the country. And what these polls also tell you is that he faces a lot of resistance beyond that coalition. It is very hard for him to get to 50% support. He's the only newly elected president in the history of Gallup polling who never has, at the outset of his presidency, ever reached 50% support in his job approval. And then what it basically says is I think Democrats may be asking the wrong question. The key question may not be how do you peel away voters who are attached to Trump. The key question for both 2018 and 2020 is, can you mobilize and consolidate the support of the majority of the country that has expressed unease about him as president from the beginning? And that's something that Hillary Clinton simply was not able to do.
Jackie, before we get to 2018, let's talk about this week. We'll shorten the calendar's expectations a tad, because given these poll numbers, but given his extremely high poll numbers with Republicans and Republicans who voted for him, he's at 96% approval rating. So what does that mean for getting health care done and tax reform done and a budget?
Just because they support him doesn't mean they're supporting what what Congress is trying to put through. Remember that health care bill that they first tried to put through had 17% approval. Now they might be blaming Congress for that, but the interesting thing about these poll numbers that I think we'll see bear out is that if he is still so low, members of Congress aren't scared of him. And when he tries to apply pressure to them, they really don't have any reason to follow him if their constituents are looking at some of his the things that he pushed and saying, you know, I'm not really on board with that. So the fact that if he doesn't have the country behind him, he's going to have a harder time getting his agenda through a Congress that might be resistant to the details.
You know, David, obviously we all know the limitations of these numbers and focus groups and panels and all those things, is that you wind up looking at a specific for something that can also be multivariate, you know. But at the end of the day, everybody's decision comes down to pretty much the same metric, barring any kind of huge, overwhelming factor. Did you make my life better? Did you raise my wages? You know, did you deal with opioids if you're up in New England? Whatever it is, that's the test, isn't it?
It is, and that's why the 100 days is one that I think the president himself is clearly got some doubts about, because you can't accomplish that much in 100 days. The stock market's been up, but that doesn't benefit many of the people who voted for Trump. The economy still looks good, but people are wondering whether or not we're in a bubble. What I find fascinating, Chris, is that the things that he accomplished most easily in that first 100 days were the things where he actually ran by the old playbook instead of by the Trump playbook. So, for example, he got Justice Gorsuch through, and that was very well done. The rollout was perfect. He got that done just right. They handled the Syrian bombing pretty well, and that was done by a pretty experienced national security team that basically said, step aside and let us go do the same thing for the summit that they had with President Xi. It's when he has gone outside of the normal rules and tried to push through something where he paid no attention to the details, like the health care bill, where I think he has run consistently into trouble. And the question is, for the next 100 days, does that tell you that there's some reasons that the swamp developed all these strange procedures?
Ron, you heard Reince Priebus there in Joe John's setup piece for us say, look, this president is achieving things at a breakneck speed. And is he talking about executive actions? Because
Yes.
President Trump has signed more executive actions than his predecessors. So is that how, can he rely on those for the next 2 years to fulfill a lot of his promises?
Only to a point. I mean, I think there are two he's right. I mean, there are two continuums. I think you have to kind of look at what President Trump has and has not been able to accomplish in the first 100 days. The first is, as you suggest, executive action versus legislative action. And they are struggling on the legislative side, obviously with health care and with tax reform having a very uncertain future that I think is going to evolve into a tax cut, because tax reform that is revenue neutral would be too difficult. So, yes, they've been able to get more done through executive action, but legislative action is more lasting. And I think the other thing that goes to David's point from a moment ago, the other continuum is between kind of the conventional Republican agenda, less regulation, less spending, less taxes, where they've been able to consolidate support and particularly to move forward on the executive side and the regulatory, and then the distinctive Trump agenda items, the economic nationalism on trade, reconsidering NATO and immigration. Of those big agenda items, only immigration is really moving forward in the way that he said on things like China as a currency manipulator. They've had to back off on NATO, on the EU. They've had to strike a different tone as they've been kind of pulled almost gravitationally toward more conventional Republican positions.
Hey, Jackie, I'll give you $1 if you can figure out who told the president to push for a vote this week on health care. Who told him?
Just $1?
Who told
That
him?
seems like it's worth
Just
more.
$1?
Times are tough, because I think you're going to get 20 answers. But he set himself up between the I have a 100-day plan, which he said all
Right.
during, and then setting those expectations for this week. That person has to be in grave trouble with the president.
It was an interesting strategy for sure. Particularly, maybe this is someone who wasn't familiar with the congressional schedule and the fact that they really can't do one thing at more than one thing, big thing at a time. They've got to worry about the government shutting down. That is not an easy process, particularly when you have the White House pushing for border spending in it. That just complicates that process. It's already rife with complications. So the fact that this health care bill, they threw out that amendment last week, that they said that they had agreement with the Freedom Caucus and the Tuesday Group, which is the more moderate Republicans. Still, that's not legislative form. And as we saw the last time, once it gets in legislative form, that's when the process actually begins. So trying to force this through such a major piece of legislation through the House, not even through the Senate, just doesn't seem like it has a place in this week's reality.
David Sanger, our world is inextricably linked to what happens in Europe. So let's talk about what happened and what we saw over the weekend yesterday with the French election. Le Pen and Macron